Welcome to SCCI Fashion Hub 2020 from the Breland Pavilion. Thank you for joining us. As we all know, global health precautions, quarantine measures and border closures continue to interrupt daily life. Times are uncertain and the world seems to have gone temporarily awry. At SCCI, we're trying to take adversity in our stride and creatively problem solve. Over the coming months, SCCI will broadcast a content-rich, for the most part Australia-focused, visually compelling virtual suite of conversations, all within the context of our usual hub format. Our cast of designers, makers, writers, authors, academics, theorists, gallerists, curators, museum leaders, activists and philanthropists are currently and progressively being filmed. We hope their wisdom and expertise will provide both inspiration and comfort to you at this trying time. Be well, be kind, and above all, be safe.
I transform nasty work into good work. I transform hate into love. That's what makes me tick.
Designing usually means to give shape to a useful object. We do not speak of designing a picture or a concerto, but we speak of designing a house, a city, a bowl, a fabric. But surely they all, like a painting or music, can be works of art.
I needed this reality probably because of my childhood broken by the war, because of extremely difficult circumstances in my country, because of revolutions and all kinds of things that were a terrible pressure on me. So I needed to create my reality which would somehow protect me.
3 European women artists are up for discussion today. Anni Albers, Louise Bourgeois, and Magdalena Abakanowicz. They were born at different times and in different places. Anni was born in Germany in 1899, end of the 19th century. Louise Bourgeois in France in 1911, pre the First World War. And Magdalena was born in 1930, between the wars, in Poland under Soviet rule. Europe is represented, obviously, by the 3 artists: Western Europe in France with Louise Bourgeois, Eastern Europe in Poland with Magdalena, and the East-West, although that, of course, occurred later when Germany split between East Germany and West Germany. So, setting the scene, Frances, best we share a little, I think, of the artists' individual backgrounds, their social milieu, the sort of world in which they found themselves, not the wide world, but the sort of outer world outside their family, and their economic circumstances, and also their domestic environments, their family circumstances. Can you just give us a little bit of a sort of comparative overview of one of these 3 artists vis-à-vis the next, and then moving on to the third?
Well, thank you, Jean. I mean, I suppose we've chosen 3 artists that of 3 different successive generations, 3 different parts of the world, but they have some significant aspects in common. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, I suppose historically, and for our understanding of women's practices in particular, is that all 3 came from quite substantial bourgeois, wealthy and cultured backgrounds. So Louise Bourgeois was born in Paris, to a couple. Her mother was from a background of weavers, and particularly with a specialism in repairing tapestries. And her father I think, trained as an architect, but then he subsequently became a tapestry dealer. So having been brought up in Paris, she was then born in Paris, brought up in rather beautiful houses. First, just outside Paris, and then subsequently at a house called Antony, again in the just beyond the suburbs on the River Bièvre. Large houses, big families, servants, workers on site, and all the trappings of a very privileged bourgeois background. Anni Albers, again, born to an architect and a cultured family in Germany at the end of the 19th century, an individual who early on wanted to become an artist and went to art school in a very privileged way for a woman at that time. And then Magdalena Abakanowicz, brought up outside Warsaw, north of Warsaw, in a very, very wealthy, aristocratic milieu. So they were all women who were privileged by their background and I suppose educated to understand the centrality of culture and visual culture in life at that time. But they were all three women, likewise, who lived through extraordinary periods of political and social unrest. So, of course, one of Louise Bourgeois' earliest memories as a child, infant, was of the First World War and her father serving in the French army in the trenches in northern France. And the family at that time moved in with her grandmother in Aubusson. And Aubusson, of course, is a very famous tapestry country. And I've always thought that many of the bourgeois' later obsessions with the body, with amputation, with wounding, with bandages, with repair, come from those very, very early experiences.
I'd not thought of that. The date is obviously very telling, but I didn't realize that she might have been in contact with that kind of distress, bodily distress. Yes.
Absolutely, very close contact. And then, I mean, later on, when Bourgeois, as a late teenager, as a student, she just graduated from the Sorbonne. She worked at as a docent at the Louvre, and of course the Louvre at that time, we're talking now the 1930s, was entirely manned by former soldiers.
I see.
Many of whom had lost limbs, so most of the guards at the Louvre were on crutches with with prosthetic limbs. So all that imagery in her work comes from that direct experience. And then, of course, Anni Albers too, foundational experience in her young life from her marriage or prior to her marriage was the rise of Hitler and fascism. It overshadowed her early years at the Bauhaus and, of course, caused her and her husband's departure for the United States.
Yes. And Magdalena. We need to go on to Magdalena.
So, of course, Magdalena, born in 1930 into a rural aristocratic background, then what shattered her life very profoundly, of course, was the Second World War and the invasion first of Germany and then of the Soviet Union and the whole decimation of the social order as she had known it. And the tragedy in her life was as a child still, when the soldiers arrived and attacked the family. And her mother was brutally wounded by Soviet soldiers arriving, lost her arm, and the whole family were effectively on the streets for a number of years during that period. So she was a huge survivor from tragedy, and that tragedy, of course, then I think very much shaped her attitude to work, her attitude to life for the rest of her life and career.
And the work itself, of course, where we see amputated trees amputated of their branches and bandaged up. I didn't realize again in the reading I did that the amputation of her mother's arm, I mean, that is a very traumatic and a deeply sort of agonizing thing to have to witness in one's mother.
After so many wars and so much suffering, Poland needed peace. She did everything to secure it. She concluded non-aggression pacts with both her neighbors and hoped that this eternal fire burning over the tomb of her unknown warrior would be a symbol of a phase in her life which had passed forever.
But this was not to be. In September 1939, in defiance of his treaty, Adolf Hitler's army made a sudden and unprovoked attack.
The very kind of visceral bodily nature of her weaving surely refers to that, amongst other things. But I suppose also later on, as Poland in the 1980s went through this really tough period of firstly martial law and then the whole opening up of Eastern Europe, there was a moment where Magdalena could have left Poland and come to the West. But I think she felt that she could not leave her parents. She could not leave her mother.
I understand that. I mean, I had my great uncle. We made a brief documentary, an hour-long documentary about him, who went back from the concentration camps back to Lithuania to find his family. When he found they had all been killed and murdered in the camps, he somehow couldn't bring himself to leave. So that is quite a visceral statement for me, because we saw it in our own family. I want to ask you now, that was a wonderful summing up, I think, of these three women from privileged backgrounds going through traumatic circumstances that were visited upon them from the outside, really, although with Louise Bourgeois there was something very painful going on within the four walls of her own house. But what I wanted to ask you now is we chose these women together because they were women, and that was a very specific sort of criterion for choosing them. You've been enormously vocal in becoming director of this most wonderful Tate Modern gallery, museum, and talking about, retrofitting in a way the collection with work by women artists, and also validating the artists who are there. But these women were living in a time when there wasn't much validation. How do you feel that they, as girls and then growing into women, how did that passage differ? Would you say, Frances, from a different passage? It's hypothetical, of course. Had they been young boys becoming artists in the same period? I mean, what was their specifically gendered experience during these, firstly, the privileged times and then the troubling times?
Well, it's such a good complex question. I don't think there's an easy answer.
No.
I mean, I think let's just let's start with Anni Albers, because because she was married to such a renowned and important painter, and her career and reputation has so much lagged behind his. I think for her, hugely ambitious. She wanted to be a painter. She fell in love with somebody who was already well-known, an important teacher and painter. And the challenge for her was that she was simply unable to access the kind of teaching and education she would have wanted, or she wanted, which would have been absolutely, without question, available to her had she been male.
That's it, yes.
But she was a remarkable woman, and in a way she made do with what she had. And I think one of the key things that you see across all these women is that they made do with the opportunities that they were given.
Yes.
Those opportunities were not the opportunities they would have had they been male, but my God, they pushed themselves to the limit.
And might have, in fact, risen further because they were pressing against obstacles than had they had easier paths laid out for them. Do you think?
Well, I absolutely... So what all of them did in their own domains is that they absolutely pushed at the rule book.
Yes.
So to take Louise Bourgeois as an example, she began as a painter.
Yes.
And she was a good painter, but they're rather slightly conventional, kind of late surrealist paintings, as you would expect of a young person of her age. When she got to America, with 3 small children and living in an apartment building on the Upper East Side, what did she do? She went up to her rooftop and she started working with the only materials available to her, which were the old bits of the water tanks on top of the rooftop. And she made sculpture. And she made sculpture that reflected the skyscrapers of New York. So she took what was there and took it to the limits. And at every point in her career, Bourgeois was somebody who just took on the challenge of this is what I have in front of me now, and pushed herself. And her career absorbed many different techniques and different materials, and extraordinarily active and self-questioning and probing. And likewise, Magdalena Abakanowicz, she too would have wanted to have been a painter. But at that moment in time, as she was studying, you have to think that Poland was part of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And as a painter, she would only have been able to paint in the subscribed official style of social realism.
Yes.
Magdalena Abakanowicz's aesthetic was schooled in early 20th century European modernism.
Yes.
She was an abstractionist. She could not have submitted to become a portrait painter.
No. And certainly not the workers of the world unite kind of portrait painter. Yes.
So she took on, very intelligently, she took a sideways move.
Yes.
So she worked in textiles, which weren't subject to those kind of restrictions. It's really interesting. All these women found an opportunity to explore their own creativity by working on the margins.
Yes, what were then the margins, but they brought the margins, of course, from the periphery to the centre as a result of their work.
People like Eugene and me, who are now pushing at those rules, we're bringing that margin to the centre, and it's incredibly exciting.
Well, I mean, the Tate Modern, having been as part of one of those wonderful committees that the museum put together in years gone by, that was a very determined and very successful, I think, and I think most people would agree, I can't imagine how you would disagree, a strategy for bringing the margins to the centre via the people in the margins who were most familiar with the work that was going on at that time. Come back to you now as in your professional world, as a curator, long-standing professional life at the Tate itself. Really, the museum's part of your DNA, now directing the museum. And how do you see these 3 women fitting into the collection? Were they in the collection, before you arrived at the directorial role? I'm sure they were, but to what extent are you intending to add to that group of acquisitions, or that one acquisition? How do you see the women in terms of the Tate?
Well, okay, let's just begin first of all with Anni Albers.
Okay.
She is the least well represented in the collection.
Yes.
I think for a very simple reason is that she was the last for the museum to become interested in. Although we made this great exhibition, I think her work was always seen very, very much in the margins.
Yes.
Because of her work in industry and in the design milieu, And you have to remember that Tate's collection has always been historically focused exclusively on fine arts.
Yes.
Originally, when I first joined the museum, that meant painting, sculpture, and works on paper.
I see.
And so we do have some works on paper by Annie. But the interest in fibre art,
Yes.
so now we're coming, for example, to Magdalena, is something that is very, very recent. And it's something
Yes.
that really came about through my personal involvement in building the collection as when I was appointed Director of Collections in 2007.
Mm-hmm.
And Abakanowicz was one of the first artists that I brought into the collection
I
in
see.
that role.
How interesting.
And
Mm.
that came about in a way quite by chance, because Magdalena had written to the museum and offered to make a gift of a late work, of a work in bronze. And I inherited this gift idea. And so I was able to interrogate it, and I was able to say to Magdalena, why don't I come and visit you and let's talk about this generous idea.
Where was she
So I went
living
to
at the
see
time? In Poland?
She was in Warsaw,
Yes.
in the house that she lived in for decades.
Uh-huh.
So I spent some time with Magdalena, and as a result of that visit to her house and then her store and her studio, we agreed that actually it'd be much more interesting for the museum to acquire a group of early works.
Uh-huh.
Partly because I always like to begin collecting.
Start at the beginning, yes.
But also because I was completely astonished to discover this early career in fibre, which I dare I say had not been aware of.
Well, I said to you on the phone, Francis, out of these three artists, the one really where I had to pull up my socks and do my homework was on Magdalena. The other two were familiar.
It was a start. I walked into a huge warehouse outside Warsaw and saw literally hundreds of these works. So, and she was fantastic, Magdalena. She completely understood we couldn't afford to buy work.
Yes.
But she really wanted it to be looked after. She was elderly, and so she gave us two of these great Abakans.
Yes.
Huge embryologies piece.
Yes.
And a number of figurative pieces.
I see.
And, they are priceless in my mind.
Have other museums or had other museums at the time collected in the United States or elsewhere in Europe?
Well, the astonishing thing is that MoMA acquired a marvellous Abakan when Abakanowicz was included in a very seminal exhibition of wall hangings in the 1960s, curated by Constantine, but they had not it since then. And the amazing thing is that's now on display in their reopened MoMA.
How wonderful is that? And Louise Bourgeois, there must have been quite a bit in the collection, no?
So I got to know Bourgeois. Bourgeois had a different trajectory. She worked pretty known to artists, but not to the public for many years of her career.
Yes.
Until in the early 1980s, MoMA did a retrospective.
Yes.
It was the first retrospective of a female artist ever to take place at MoMA.
Good heavens.
And the reason that happened was really the enthusiasm of curators like Deborah Y at the museum.
I remember Deborah Y. I met her once many years ago.
They were just
determined, yes.
So I got to know her as a result of MoMA's attention.
I see.
And got really interested, and I went to visit her at the end of the 1980s. So I was a very young curator.
Yes.
And we acquired a cell piece. But after that, I put her in an exhibition, invited her to be in an exhibition in 95. Then I invited her to do the opening commission for Tate Modern in 2000.
Yes.
So that just basically built a really close relationship with her in the studio. So that when in the early 2000s, we asked whether we could do a retrospective.
Yes.
Louise was very gracious to say that, Tate could do the retrospective and then it would tour.
Yes. And one of my great regrets in life, I have to say, after doing research for this talk, is that in 2007, 2008, when that tour took place, I was closing the commercial Sherman galleries. Remember, you and I have discussed
Yes.
that move in the past
Yes.
from the commercial to the not-for-profit. And it was a huge, I mean, it doesn't seem perhaps big now, but at the time I was letting down a lot of people. I had been, running a successful gallery for 21 years, and that was my transition, 2007, 2008. Now, this is also a women-focused question, but a sort of inverted one, and that is... we're putting Annie now in America, and she's at the college, Black Mountain College, this very progressive school. They're there for years and years before, the two of them, teaching and living together and, traveling together. But there were other artists working at the time, and I'm taking that period from the time they arrived in 1933, roughly, at Black Mountain College and in the United States at Black Mountain College, to 1949 when they moved on to Yale, and he became a famous professor.
What then, of course, Black Mountain allowed Annie to do, I think, is like have a second adolescence.
Yes, that's lovely.
Because there she was,
yes.
With a younger generation of super cool American hipsters.
Yes.
It was Mel Cunningham and John Cage.
Yes.
And Rauschenberg.
Yes.
And this wonderful, but also there was mathematics and philosophy.
Yes.
And suddenly in a way, it feels like Annie was able to go back to basics.
Yes.
And she did a lot of work with really reinventing the loom.
Yes.
Combining what she'd learned in her travels to Latin America. So very, very reacquainting herself with materials, with textures, with nature.
Yes.
It feels like a sort of second childhood for her.
Yes.
And I think that feeds into that sort of joyous, just like explosion of creativity in the work at that time.
I think, also that ability to be free, the Bauhaus, from what I've ever been able to gather about it, it was quite sort of strict and disciplined and German and...
Designing usually means to give shape to a useful object. We do not speak of designing a picture or a concerto, but we speak of designing a house, a city, a bowl, a fabric. But surely they all, like a painting or music, can be works of art.
Yeah, I'm beginning to understand through this conversation, and of course through my reading, how integrated she was. She was into the art world of the time. She wasn't really crying from the margins, let me in a way. No, it sounded as though people knew.
Her work makes me feel that we were the ghetto, not her.
Yeah, I know what you mean. She was at the heart of things.